I want to start by saying something that probably sounds ridiculous, but I need to say it anyway. The first time I made them soup, 3 of them cried. Not sad crying, not scared crying, the kind of crying that doesn't have a name yet in any language I know, the kind that happens when something you forgot you were missing suddenly shows back up in front of you and you don't have the words for it. That kind. They didn't make a sound. They just sat there at the long metal table in Sector 7 Gamma, these small iridescent beings with their 4 arms folded against their chests, and their enormous dark eyes going glassy and wet, and they looked at the bowls in front of them like the bowls had personally wronged them in some beautiful way. And I stood at the kitchen hatch, not knowing what to do. That was day 4. By day 4, I still hadn't really figured out what I was doing there. On a good day, I called myself a cook. On a bad day, I called myself a man who'd run out of reasons to stay on Earth and ended up floating around the outer corridors of a neutral station at the edge of Faranatha-controlled space with nothing but a set of carbon steel pots and a stubbornness his grandmother had called unfortunate. The Orphans had been on Station Vera 9 for about 6 weeks before I arrived. 43 of them, ages ranging from what the station administrators estimated to be roughly 2 standard galactic years up to about 14, all Faranatha. All from the same cluster of colonies that had been caught in the crossfire of the Catharis border conflict, a war I won't pretend to fully understand even now. What I understood was simpler. These children had lost their homes, lost most of their caregivers, and ended up here, on a station that wasn't built for them, in a wing of the station that had been repurposed from cargo storage in about 3 days, by people who were doing their best, but didn't really know what their best needed to look like. The Galactic Humanitarian Registry had been running nutrition deliveries, pressed nutrient blocks, hydration supplements, standardized caloric packages, everything technically sufficient, everything calculated correctly, everything assembled with care by people who had run the numbers and ticked the boxes. The children weren't eating. Not refusing exactly. They'd take a block, hold it, sometimes bite the corner, but the weight logs were showing decline. 3 of the younger ones had been moved to the medical bay for monitoring. The station's lead administrator, a Corvathi named Prelian who wore the specific expression of someone managing 9 disasters at once, had filed an emergency request to the GHR for alternative nutritional approaches. I don't know exactly how my name ended up on that request. Something about a volunteer database. Something about a note I'd written 6 months earlier when I signed up for the registry. Something like I can cook for anyone. I've cooked for everyone. I'm not picky about species. Apparently, that was unusual enough to flag. So there I was. Vera 9 is not a pretty station. I want to be honest about that. It's a transit hub, originally, built for cargo processing and fuel exchange at the intersection of 3 shipping lanes. The architecture is purely functional. Gray paneling, low ceilings in the corridors, bright industrial lighting that doesn't know the concept of ambience. The kind of place where you can hear the hum of the atmospheric processors at all times. A constant low sound, like the station is breathing and mildly inconvenienced about it. The wing they'd given the children was in the eastern arm, Sector 7 Gamma. It had been storage for industrial components, coolant canisters, pressure regulators, machine parts waiting for redistribution. Someone had cleared it out, brought in sleeping platforms, set up environmental controls to approximate Faranatha atmospheric preferences, which meant the air in that corridor was slightly warmer and carried a faint mineral scent, iron adjacent, almost like rain on hot stone. It wasn't unpleasant. Once I got used to it, I actually liked it. The kitchen they gave me was adjacent to the wing. I say kitchen. It was a prep room, really. It had a matter compiler, 2 standard heating units, a cold storage array, and about 12 square meters of working space. The compiler could fabricate basic foodstuffs from raw molecular stock. The heating units were commercial grade. The storage held whatever I could requisition from station supply. Day one I walked in, looked at all of it and stood there for a while. I didn't have a plan. I want to make that clear. There is no playbook for this. There's no culinary school course called Cooking for Alien Orphans on a repurposed cargo station at the edge of known space. I was a guy who'd cooked in restaurant kitchens for 15 years, then done a stint with a disaster relief organization on Earth, then spent 3 years bouncing between aid postings in various parts of the solar system, and then, longer story than I have space to tell here, ended up on the voluntary registry with a note about not being picky. What I knew about Fahranathi food came from 2 sources: a hastily downloaded species brief from the GHR's database, and a very long conversation with a Fahranathi academic named Sar of Quiet Waters, who'd reached me via comm the day before I boarded the shuttle. The species brief was clinical. Fahranathi are omnivores, preferred temperature range for food, slightly warmer than human standard, texture sensitivity, moderate to high, known flavor receptors, 7 distinct categories, 3 of which map loosely onto human analogs and 4 of which have no equivalent in Earth cuisine. Sar of Quiet Waters was more helpful. She'd spent years studying interspecies food culture, and she spoke with the kind of specific urgency that told me she was genuinely worried about these kids. The problem, she told me, is not the nutrition. The problem is that Fahranathi children, especially young ones, don't experience food as fuel. They experience it as communication. The act of being fed is not separate from the act of being cared for. For them, functionally, they are the same act. When the blocks arrived, and the blocks are fine, nutritionally fine, the children received the message that their nutrition mattered, but they did not. She paused. I know how that sounds. It sounds right, I said. Cook for them the way you would cook for someone you are glad to see, she told me. That is the only instruction I can give you. I wrote it on the back of my hand before I boarded the shuttle. Washed off 2 days later, but by then I had it memorized. Day 1 in the kitchen, I just made bread. Not because I thought it was the right tactical decision. I made bread because it was what I knew how to make when I didn't know what else to do. My grandmother on my mother's side was a woman who made bread every Sunday of her life, and she taught me young and bread-making lives in the hands before it lives in the head. I used the matter compiler to fabricate flour, water, salt, a small amount of something the database suggested might work as a Fahranathi-safe leavening agent. I mixed it by hand. I have this thing about mixing bread by hand. It's probably irrational, I don't care. And I let it sit and I shaped it and I put it in the heating unit and I let it bake. The smell spread down the corridor. I know this because I was told about it afterward. I wasn't in the corridor. I was in the kitchen watching the bread through the unit's small viewing panel. But apparently the smell reached 7 Gamma, and some of the older children came to the corridor entrance to investigate and stood there not knowing what they were doing or why they'd come. Station Administrator Prelian came to find me about 20 minutes after the bread came out. He was a tall being. Prelian Korvathi are tall, 7 feet or so, with a dark blue-gray coloring and 4 eyes arranged in a slight arc. He moved carefully in low-ceiling spaces. He stooped slightly to come through my kitchen doorway and then stood there looking at the bread on the counter. "What is that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Bread," I said. "It is not in the nutritional protocol." "No," I agreed. He looked at me. Then he looked at the bread again. He had the expression of a man running a cost-benefit calculation that he hadn't anticipated needing to run. "The children," he said carefully, "came into the corridor." "Did they?" "Several of them are still there." I cut a piece of bread and held it out to him. He took it carefully with 2 of his 4 hands, turned it over and took a very small, very cautious bite. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted. "I'll need to file an amended protocol request," he said. "I figured," I said. He took the rest of the piece with him when he left. Day 2, I brought the bread to them. I put it on the long table in the common area of 7 Gamma on a plain metal tray with a cloth underneath it. I'd found some station-issue cloth in a supply cabinet and cut it to size. I didn't know if the cloth meant anything to them. I brought it anyway. There were maybe 15 children in the common area when I came in. The others were in the sleeping section or the play area. They'd set up a rough play area with some adaptive toys the GHR had sent, though I'd noticed most of those toys sat unused. The children tended to cluster together in the corners, the smaller ones tucked against the larger ones. When I came in with the tray, they went very still. I put the tray on the table and stepped back. I didn't hover. My instinct was to step back and give them space. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then the oldest child, I'd learn her name later, the name she allowed me to use was a sound roughly translatable as Ember, came forward. She was 14 or so, tall for her age, with deep amber iridescence in her skin and eyes that were a very dark gold. She looked at the bread. She looked at me. She picked up a piece. She didn't eat it right away. She held it in 2 of her 4 hands and smelled it. Then she touched it lightly with the tips of 2 fingers. Then she took a bite. She chewed slowly. I kept my face as neutral as I could. I didn't watch her too closely. I looked at the tray, at the table, at a point roughly adjacent to where she was standing. She made a sound, very quiet. It was a vocalization I hadn't heard any of them make before, something between a hum and a sigh, 3-toned, layered. I found out later it's a sound that roughly translates to "this is real." Not "this is good" or "I like this." Just "this is real." Within 2 minutes, the others had come forward. They ate all of it. Not ravenously, carefully, like it mattered, like the eating itself was something that deserved attention. I went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a while. Cook for them the way you would cook for someone you are glad to see. I'd been glad to see them. I hadn't expected to be, I want to be honest about that. I'd expected to feel competent, professional, useful. I hadn't expected the specific ache that came from watching 40-odd displaced children cluster around bread on a metal table like it was the first real thing they'd touched in weeks. But there it was. Day 3, I tried something more ambitious. I spent most of the morning with the database and the matter compiler, cross-referencing Fahrenheit nutritional profiles with what the compiler could fabricate. There are things that don't translate certain mineral compounds the Fahrenheit metabolic system requires that have to be sourced specifically, and that the compiler could only approximate. I flagged this to Prelian, and he got me an emergency supply requisition within 4 hours, which told me he was either very efficient or very motivated or both. Sarov Quiet Waters had mentioned in passing something called Velschen, a traditional Fahrenheit comfort food. She described it, but the description she gave was vague because her specialty was cultural anthropology, not cuisine. She knew what it meant, not exactly what it was. Something warm, something with layers, something that takes time to make. I didn't know how to make Velschen. No human did, probably, but I understood the concept. Something warm, layered, time invested. A dish that takes time to make because the time is part of the point. I spent 3 hours making a stew. Not a Fahrenheit stew, I want to be clear. I wasn't trying to approximate or impersonate their cuisine. I made a human stew, but I made it the long way. Slow-built stock, multiple layers of flavor added in stages, aromatics that the database suggested might be pleasant to Fahrenheit sensory receptors, adjusted temperature. I tasted it 17 times and adjusted it 17 times, and at the end I had something that was thoroughly mine and hopefully readable. I added a mineral supplement the supply requisition had come in with, tasteless to me, but apparently it carries a particular flavor note for Fahrenheit that Sarov Quiet Waters described as something like sunshine in spring. I had no way of knowing if I was getting the dosage right for flavor rather than just nutrition, but I tried. I brought it to them in the same tray arrangement, added some of the remaining bread. That was the day 3 of them cried. I learned their names slowly, over days. Not all of them. The youngest ones had names that required vocal capacities. I simply didn't have sounds made with resonators I don't possess. But the older children, the ones who'd been observing me most closely, eventually started allowing me to use approximations. Ember, as I've said, the oldest. She was quiet and careful, and she watched everything. She had a way of tilting her head slightly when I was cooking, a very specific angle that I came to understand meant she was trying to understand the process. Not just what I was making, how I was making it, the sequence of decisions. The child I called Silt was about 9 or 10, and completely unlike Ember in temperament. Where Ember was still, Silt was in constant motion. 4 arms going at all times, always touching things, examining them, turning them over. He found the kitchen irresistible. By day 6, he'd taken to standing at the kitchen hatch and watching me work, and by day 8 I'd installed a step stool and let him stand on the prep side so he could see the counter. There was a pair of younger children, I estimated about 5 or 6, who were inseparable. I called them Rain and Stone because they seemed to embody those things in some elemental way I couldn't have articulated at the time. Rain was expressive, emotional, always vocalizing in quiet streams of sound. Stone was solid, grounded, usually had a hand on Rain's arm or shoulder. They sat together at every meal and ate at the same pace, like they were breathing together. The others filled in around these 4 in my understanding, gradually, day by day. By the end of the first week, I knew the seating arrangement by heart. Who sat where, who ate faster, who needed smaller portions distributed across more servings because they'd been under-eating for long enough that their systems had adjusted, who liked to smell the food first and who went straight to tasting, who looked at me when they ate and who deliberately looked away. That last one mattered. I'd noticed that 2 of the younger children couldn't look at me while they were eating. Not hostility, nothing like that. More like the eating itself required a kind of vulnerability they could only maintain if they weren't simultaneously managing eye contact with an unfamiliar presence. So I would set their portions down, and then find a reason to be at the counter with my back to the table for a while. Small things, human things, things that aren't in any protocol. The station had a rotating staff of maybe 80 people. Humans, Corvathi, a couple of Thrani, one Pell being named Wavering Light on Stillwater who worked atmospheric maintenance, and occasionally stopped by the kitchen to ask what I was making with what seemed like genuine academic curiosity. Most of the staff were kind, some were busy. A few were initially skeptical of what I was doing. The amended protocol request had generated some administrative friction, and I overheard, once, a conversation between 2 staff members about whether the cooking program was within sanctioned parameters, and whether a human volunteer with no xenobiology qualifications should be making decisions about what children of another species consumed. These were fair concerns, technically. They stopped being a friction point around day 9, when the station medic, a human named Dr. Carla Messier, who had 2 decades of interspecies medical experience and the demeanor of someone who has seen enough that very little surprises her, updated the weight and health monitoring logs. All 3 of the children who'd been in medical observation had returned to the common area. All 43 children were showing improved nutritional uptake. The youngest were still monitored, but their trajectories had reversed. Dr. Messier stopped by the kitchen that afternoon. She looked around, looked at the pots, looked at me. "I've been doing this for 22 years, she said. "I've never seen a nutritional reversal at that rate without medical intervention." "I made them soup," I said. She laughed. It was a short laugh, the kind that isn't really about humor. "Keep making the soup," she said. By the end of week 2, something had shifted in the texture of the days. The children had started to show up at the kitchen hatch before meals. Not demanding, They never demanded anything, and there was something about that broke my heart quietly every day. They showed up and waited. Sometimes they'd bring things to show me through the hatch, objects they'd found, adaptive toys reassembled into different configurations, drawings made on station-issue data pads with the artistic tools set to free-draw mode. One of the middle children, whose name approximated to something I rendered as Birch, brought me a careful drawing of what I eventually figured out was the kitchen from their perspective through the hatch. The counter, the heating units, the pots. I was in it too, a small figure at the center. Slightly blurry, the way figures are when they're important but the artist is young, and the hands haven't caught up to the vision yet. I put it on the kitchen wall. Silt saw it there the next day and made a sound I didn't have context for yet. He looked at it for a long time, then looked at me, then went back to his observation post on the step stool. I was making a grain dish that morning, something the matter compiler could produce a reasonable analog of, with additions from the mineral supply and some texture modifications based on my now 2 weeks of observation of what the children responded to. Silt watched me work. I narrated loosely, not lecturing, just talking. This goes in here, and then we wait a little. This one needs heat first. This doesn't go in until the end, or it loses something. He watched my hands constantly. Around the middle of the second week, he reached out and touched the side of one of the pots, not the hot surface, the handle. He looked at his own hand. Then he looked at the pot. "You can stir it if you want," I said. I don't know if he understood the words, but he understood the gesture when I handed him the spoon. He stirred the pot for about 30 seconds, very seriously, his 4 arms managing the coordination in a way I found quietly astonishing, 2 of them on the spoon, 2 steadying himself on the counter's edge. Then he handed the spoon back and stepped off the step stool and went back to the common area. At lunch, he ate the grain dish with what I had come to recognize as particular attentiveness, like tasting something was different when you'd had a hand in it. There were harder days. I want to record those too. Around day 18, something happened that I still don't fully understand. The children became very quiet, quieter than usual, which was already quiet. The younger ones stayed close to the older ones. Ember sat in the corner of the common area with her knees drawn up and 3 of the youngest ones pressed against her sides, and she didn't move for most of the morning. I didn't know what had triggered it. Station staff checked the records. There'd been a standard communication cycle the night before, which included news updates from the GHR feeds. Something in those feeds, apparently, something about the Catharis conflict. I was told the news wasn't good, but I wasn't given details. I made a very simple meal that day, simpler than I'd been making. Warm, mild, easy. I brought it earlier than usual and set it on the table without any ceremony. Ember looked at me from across the room. I didn't say anything, I just looked back. Something passed between us that I couldn't categorize then and still can't categorize now. I was a stranger. I was also, in some complicated and incomplete way, the person who showed up every day with something warm. Those 2 things existed at the same time. She got up eventually and came to the table, and the younger ones came with her. They ate. They were still quiet, but they ate. I went back to the kitchen, and I did the dishes by hand because the automated system was functioning perfectly fine, and I needed something to do with my hands. Week 3, and I had a rhythm. Morning, stock prep, grain or protein component, vegetable analog. The matter compiler was getting better at my specifications, or I was getting better at specifying, or both. Midday, main meal always warm, always something that required work to make. Evening, something simpler, sometimes just bread and a supplemented beverage, but always present, always timed. I'd started varying the meals more deliberately, paying attention to what created the most positive response, not just eating, but the quality of engagement with the food. There were dishes that the children ate efficiently and dishes they lingered over. I wanted the lingering ones. It wasn't about taste preferences exactly, at least not entirely. It was about texture, warmth, something I started calling meal weight in my own notes, which was my term for the sense a meal gives you that it took time to make. That someone's attention was in it. The supplemented beverages were a particular challenge. The Farinathi have a strong relationship with what Sorrow of Quiet Waters had described as communal warm drink, something culturally significant in her description, served at important moments, at gathering times, at occasions of transition. I didn't know the specific preparation. I spent a lot of evenings trying variations. Around day 22, I hit something that was close. I was using the matter compiler for the base liquid, adding specific mineral compounds, then heating it and adding an aromatic element from the supply that the database listed as festive ceremonial without further elaboration. I'd been ignoring that supply packet because ceremonial seemed too specific, too potentially wrong to guess at. But that evening I was running out of other options and I opened it. The smell when it heated was extraordinary. Not to me, it smelled mineral and faintly sweet, not unpleasant but not remarkable. But when I carried the serving tray to the common area and the smell preceded me through the door, every single child in the room went completely still. Then the sound started. All of them simultaneously. That three-toned vocalization, "This is real," the one Ember had made on day 2 when she first tasted the bread. But all of them at once, layered into something that I can only describe as a chord, a harmony, something that filled the room. I stood very still in the doorway with the tray. Ember was on her feet. She came toward me slowly, then stopped. Her dark gold eyes were very bright. She said something in Farinathi that I couldn't parse. Then she said something else. One word, translated by the station's ambient interpretation system, with a 2-second lag. Mother. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking about the smell. I understood this in the moment, even before anyone explained it to me later. She wasn't calling me mother. She was saying the smell was associated with something maternal, with something she'd lost. I carried the tray to the table. I poured the drinks. I went back to the kitchen, and I sat on the floor for about 20 minutes. Not crying exactly, though also honestly a little crying. The weeks accumulated. Week 4, week 5. A routine had settled into something more than routine, something structural. The children knew the sound of the heating units warming up. They knew the sequence of smells that meant which meal was coming. They had started, several of the older ones, to time their arrival at the kitchen hatch by those cues, coming earlier for meals they particularly liked, arriving with less urgency for the ones they were neutral on. This was information. Extremely useful information. I kept notes. My notes by week 5 were extensive. Which child preferred higher temperatures? Which texture variants got the most engagement? Which combinations of flavors produced the 3-tone vocalization, and which produced a different sound, lower 2-toned, that the ambient interpreter translated variably as familiar or known or sometimes just yes. I had also started to understand their names better. Not pronounce them, that remained largely impossible, but understand them. Farinathi personal names are not fixed identifiers the way human names are. They shift across time and relationship. The name a child carries among close family is different from the name they carry among acquaintances, and different again in formal contexts. The names the children had been using with me were something like their middle names, their everyday names, their "this is who I am when I am comfortable" names. Ember had told me this, not directly, but through a very long and patient exchange that involved her drawing on a data pad and me making guesses, and the ambient interpreter doing its best. I don't think I fully understood until day 31, when she told me her name in a way she hadn't told me before, a name that was longer, more layered, something the interpreter took a long time with. The name I carry for people who are home, The interpreter said slowly, like it was working hard. I don't know if I responded correctly. I don't know what the correct response was. I said her name back to her, or my closest approximation of it, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she went back to the common area. I counted that as a good day, one of the best. Station log Vera 9, day 38 of Orphan Housing Protocol, Administrator Prelian. The human volunteer Drummond has now been running the nutrition program for 38 days. I want to enter this note for the official record because I believe it will be relevant for future GHR protocols. The change in the children's condition, since Drummond's arrival, is not clinically explicable through nutrition alone. Dr. Messier and I reviewed the data extensively, and the conclusion we have arrived at, and I want to be careful with language here, is that Drummond is providing something that is not captured in the nutritional protocol schema. In Korvathi tradition, we have a concept called velathari. It does not translate precisely. The closest approximation I've found in human language is witnessed being, the experience of being seen and tended by a presence that chooses to see and tend you. Young Korvathi who are separated from their home groups have been observed to decline even with nutritionally complete provisions. The reversal is typically achieved through velathari from a consistent caregiver. I would suggest that something analogous is occurring here. I do not know if the Faranathi have a named concept for it, but the 43 children in Sector 7 Gamma are exhibiting behavioral markers that I can only read as the gradual reestablishment of fundamental security. They are laughing now. Not all of them, not every day, but some of them sometimes. I thought it worth recording that this was not the case 38 days ago. Prelian. Day 40. I remember day 40 specifically, because that was the day Silt cooked for the first time. Not independently, I was there, I guided him through it. He'd been watching me long enough that he'd started making preparation gestures in the air beside him when he was watching me work, mimicking the motion of stirring or folding or applying heat with the careful seriousness of someone practicing. I'd noticed this and thought about it, and decided to invite him in properly. So on day 40, I set up the station with a second step stool and I walked him through making the grain dish from the beginning. Not instructing in a formal sense, I don't think language instruction would have gotten us far. More demonstrating, step by step, waiting, watching him follow, adjusting when his motion was off, letting him figure out the small resistances and yields of the materials. He understood the heat better than I expected. He had an instinct for when something needed more and when to pull back. I found this fascinating. I watched his faces. Faranathi have 4 facial expression zones, layered differently than humans, and I'd been learning to read them, and his concentration was absolute. He made the grain dish. It was good. I tasted it and it was genuinely good. We brought it to the table together. When the other children realized Silt had made it, there was a long moment of collective recognition. I could see it move through the room like a current. Then they started eating, and I could see by the way they looked at him that something was different in that eating. Something was being acknowledged. He sat down with them, all 4 arms folded, posture careful, trying to look like this hadn't mattered. It had mattered. Everyone in that room knew it had mattered. Day 47. I want to be precise about this day, because it's where the story changes. I was in the kitchen early, earlier than usual. I'd been planning a more elaborate meal because it was approximately the 1 standard month anniversary of when the children had arrived on the station. And while I had no idea if they tracked time that way or if the date meant anything to them, it seemed to me like a reason to do something particular. I was deep in prep work when the station alert system activated. Not an emergency alert, not that harsh rising tone. The other one, the formal arrival announcement, incoming vessel, docking bay 7, authorization code, Faranathi Imperial. I remember I had flour on my hands. I stood there and stared at the ceiling where the announcement was coming from, the way you do when the sound is overhead and your brain hasn't processed the content yet. Faranathi Imperial. I put down what I was holding, and I washed my hands, and I went to find Prelian. He was already moving when I reached him, striding down the main corridor toward the administrative center with 4 of his 6 hands doing different things simultaneously. One holding a data pad, one gesturing in a comm, one adjusting the environmental system controls at a wall panel, one apparently just being a hand while he sorted out what the other 3 were doing. Prelian, I said. He looked at me with 2 of his eyes, while the other 2 stayed on the data pad. Imperial Code, I said. Yes. What does that mean? It means, he said carefully, that someone from the Faranathi Imperial structure is coming to the station. The authorization code is high level, very high level. He paused. I've sent for more information. I don't have it yet. Should the children know? He was quiet for 1 second. Not yet, he said. Make breakfast. I went back and made breakfast. The vessel docked at 8:40 station time. I didn't see it arrive. I was in the kitchen. But wavering lights on Stillwater came to the kitchen hatch 20 minutes after the docking announcement and told me, in that careful, precise way of the Pell, that the vessel was a Faranathi Imperial craft, long-range, formally marked, and that it had come through 3 relay points from deep Faranathi space. Do they know? I asked the children. I think Ember knows, wavering light on Stillwater said. I passed through 7 Gamma on my way here. She was standing in the middle of the room, very still, looking at the ceiling where the announcement came from. I absorbed this. She didn't look scared, wavering light on Stillwater added. She looked like someone who has been waiting for a sound, and the sound finally came. I kept cooking. I didn't know what else to do. Part 2, The Queen Mother. Testimony Addendum, Prelian Station Administrator, Vera 9. I will try to describe the arrival accurately. The delegation came through Docking Bay 7. There were 6 of them initially, 4 members of the Imperial Guard, then 2 court officials. All of them moved with the precise economy of people who are very aware of their position at all times. Then the Queen Mother came through. I want to record that I have been a station administrator for 19 years. I have received delegations from 11 different species, including 3 that are classified by the GHR as high ceremony cultures. I am not easily made to feel the weight of a room change. The room changed. She was not what I had expected from the images in the Imperial Registry files. The files showed formal portraiture, the full traditional markings, the ceremonial garments, the specific posture of official representation. What came through the docking port was a woman, and I use the word woman deliberately, because that is the category her bearing occupied, who had been traveling for a long time and was not trying to look like anything except what she was. Her name in the full formal rendering is a Faranathi title sequence that the ambient interpreter takes approximately 4 seconds to process. In shortened form, it is Ailvashara. She is the Queen Mother of the Faranathi Second House, and she is, according to everything I know about her, the closest living relative of the majority of the 43 children in Sector 7 Gamma. She did not come to inspect or to administer. She did not come with documentation. She looked at me and said, "Where are they?" I said, "Follow me." Prelian. I heard them before I saw them. Not the Queen Mother's delegation. I heard the children. That sound, the one I'd first heard on day 2 when Ember tasted the bread. This is real. But now it wasn't 3 voices. It wasn't the full 43 in the shared chord of the beverage evening. It was something else. Something that went past language in a way the ambient interpreter didn't try to catch up with. I was in the kitchen. The door between the kitchen and 7 Gamma's corridor was a sliding panel, not a sealed door. There'd been no reason to seal it. and somewhere in the second week, I'd started leaving it slightly open because the smell of cooking from the corridor seemed to do something good. I heard the sound through that gap. I stood at my counter and I kept my hands moving. I was finishing the morning meal, I had grain on the heat, I had bread already done, and I just listened. The sound was not like anything I had a reference for. It was not grief, not joy, not relief. It was all of those things collapsed into something more fundamental, something pre-verbal, something that existed before any of those words did. It went on for a long time. I met her 40 minutes later. Prelian came to the kitchen with his specific expression of someone managing 9 disasters, except this time the expression had something underneath it, not quite wonder, but the cousin of it. "The Queen Mother would like to speak with you," he said. I looked down at myself, kitchen clothes. Flour on my sleeve again, apparently a permanent feature of my existence. Some kind of grain residue on my right hand. "Now," I said. "Yes," he said. I wiped my hands on the cloth I kept over my shoulder and went. She was in the common area of 7 Gamma. The children were with her, not in the careful clustered way they developed for unfamiliar adults, not held back or uncertain. They were around her, physically around her, the smaller ones making contact, the older ones close. Ember was sitting beside her with their shoulders touching, Ember's posture entirely different from anything I'd seen, something released in it, something that had been held for a long time finally let down. The Imperial Guard was at the perimeter. The court officials were toward the far wall, one of them making notes on a device. Wavering Light on Stillwater was somehow also present, standing near the environmental panel with the expression of someone who was definitely not eavesdropping. The Queen Mother looked at me when I came in. Her eyes were the same dark gold as Ember's. She was tall, Pharanathi adults tend toward height, and she was taller than most. The travel that Prelian had mentioned was visible in her, not dishevelment exactly, but something worn in around the edges, like someone who had moved fast and far and hadn't stopped to process any of it. She looked at me for a long moment. The ambient interpreter was running. I could see the small indicator light on Prelian's collar. "You are the one who cooks," she said. The interpreter gave me the words with a slight lag. "Yes," I said. "Every day. Every day." She was quiet. One of the younger children, Rain, I thought, recognizing the particular way of moving, shifted slightly from their position against her side and looked at me, then back at her, then back at me. "Sit," the Queen Mother said. It wasn't a command exactly. It was an invitation that had a lot of weight behind it. I sat at the table. She sat across from me. The children arranged themselves. The guard stayed where they were. Prelian stood near the door. The court official kept making notes. The conversation was long. Long enough that Prelian eventually had someone bring chairs for the officials. Long enough that I got up once to check on the grain on the heat. It would have scorched otherwise, and came back with the morning meal, which I put on the table between us because it was ready, and because I didn't know what else to do with it. She looked at the bowls. "May I?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She lifted the bowl and held it in both of her primary hands. She smelled it, then she tasted it. Her expression was different from the children's, older, more layered. The 3-tone sound she made was quieter, but it was there. She asked me about the mineral supplement in the beverage. She asked me about the bread. She asked me, with a specificity that surprised me, about the sequence of the days, what I'd made and in what order, how I'd figured out what to make when I had no knowledge of Pharanathi cuisine. I told her, all of it, about Sorrow of Quiet Waters and what she'd said about food as communication, about making bread because it was what I knew to do when I didn't know what to do, about watching them eat and making notes, about the aromatic from the ceremonial supply packet. Her expression when I got to that part. "Where did you get that compound?" she said. The supply requisition. It was listed as festive or ceremonial. I wasn't sure what it was exactly. I tried it because I'd run out of other options. It is used, she said slowly, at births, at returns, at the formal welcome of someone who has been away. She paused. You did not know this. I didn't know this, I said. And yet you used it. I was out of other options, I said again. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the bowl in her hands. Then she looked at Ember, who was sitting 2 places down the table eating with the focused attentiveness she'd always brought to meals. She told me about you, the Queen Mother said. On the comm 4 days ago when I was still 3 relay points out. She said. The interpreter worked for a moment. She said, there is a human here who shows up every day. I didn't know what to say. For Faranathi children who have lost their home, the Queen Mother said, there is no more significant thing that can be said of a person. She stayed for 2 days. I want to be precise about what those 2 days were, because I think they're important. She wasn't there in an official capacity exactly. Or rather, the official capacity was present, but it was not the point. The GHR documentation, the status reviews, the formal protocols around orphan care and repatriation, those were handled by Prelian and the court officials in a series of meetings I was not part of. What she was doing, for the most part, was being in 7 Gamma with the children. And eating. 3 meals a day, she was at the table. She brought the children to the table with the kind of easy authority that came from being known to them since their first memory. She sat with them and she ate what I made, and she told them things in Faranathi that I couldn't follow, but the room's feeling told me were the right things. The things that had been needed, that had been waiting. I cooked. On the first evening, she came to the kitchen hatch while I was cleaning up. She stood at the hatch the way the children had stood in the early days, observing, present, not demanding anything. May I come in, she said. Of course, I said. She came around through the corridor entrance and stood in the small kitchen space. She was too tall for it, really. She stood with her head at the low ceiling's edge, her upper arms folded, her secondary arms loose. She looked at the pots, the counter, Birch's drawing still on the wall. She looked at the drawing for a long time. He always drew, she said, even as a very small child. Her voice was different when she said it, quieter. I left her with the drawing for a moment. How did you manage the temperature calibration? She asked eventually. Faranathi optimal serving temperature is narrower than most species maintain. The standard GHR equipment runs cool. I measured, I said. I tested. I burned myself twice figuring out the heating unit settings because the readout is in Korvathi units, and I kept doing the conversion wrong. You burned yourself. Just my hand, just twice, it's fine. She looked at my hands. I have a small scar on the heel of my right palm from the second burn. She looked at it with an expression I couldn't fully read. You are a strange person, she said. I've been told, I said. I mean that with great respect. I know, I said, and I did. She asked me that evening what I knew about the Catharis conflict. Not as a test, as a genuine question. She was sitting on the only stool in the kitchen. She had to hunch slightly to fit, which she did without comment. And I was washing the larger pots by hand because the automated system and I had a complicated relationship. I know it was a border conflict, I said. I know colonies were caught in the middle. I know these children lost most of their caregivers in the displacement. I don't know much more than that. Most of your species doesn't know more than that, she said. There was no accusation in it, just observation. No, I agreed. The Catharis have been pressing the second house boundary for 11 standard years, she said. My house. The children here, most of them are from the outer colonies in the second house's territory. When the conflict escalated, the evacuation sequence was not fast enough. We got many out. We did not get everyone. She was quiet. I was at the Imperial Convocation when it escalated. 3 relay points from here, or I would have come sooner. You came as soon as you could, I said. I came as soon as I could, she said. Then, it is not the same as being here. There was nothing useful for me to say to that, so I didn't say anything. Ember led them through, she said after a while, the eldest by 3 years. 14 standard years old, and she led 42 children through a relocation corridor in a conflict zone and got them onto the evacuation shuttle. The evacuation report said, child-led group. The people writing the report didn't understand what they were writing. I did know this. Prelian had told me early on, and I had sat with it in the way you sit with things that are too large to process quickly. I know, I said. She trusts you, the Queen Mother said. This is not a small thing. Ember does not extend trust quickly under normal circumstances. Under these circumstances. She shook her head slightly. What did you do? I showed up, I said, and I kept showing up. She looked at me. Yes, she said, that is exactly what you did. On the morning of the second day, I made the ceremonial beverage again. Deliberately this time, knowing what it was. I brought it to the table in the morning before the formal meal and set it in front of each place. When the Queen Mother came in with the children, they were already moving differently, I noticed, something restored in the way they occupied space. She saw it and stopped. She looked at me from across the room. You know what this is now, she said. You told me last night, I said. This is a welcome beverage, she said slowly, a returning home beverage. She looked at the room, at the children taking their places, at the station walls around them gray and functional. We are not home. No, I said, but you're together. I thought that's the part that matters for the beverage, not the place, the being together. She was quiet for a moment. You might be right, she said. In the traditional understanding, the beverage marks the return of someone to their people, not necessarily to a location. She was still looking at the room. We have argued about this for generations, actually. There are scholars on both sides. Sorry for creating a theological dilemma, I said. She made a sound I hadn't heard her make before. After a second, I recognized it as laughter. Faranathi laughter is triple-toned and brief, and she'd suppressed most of it, but what got through was unmistakably laughter. I think you may resolve several generations of scholarly debate, she said. Sit down. Have the beverage with us. I sat down. The children were watching me. Ember was watching me from her seat beside the Queen Mother, that careful gold gaze that had been one of the first things I'd learned to hold. We drank the beverage together, all of us at the table, the guard at the perimeter, Prelian, who had appeared in the doorway at some point and nobody had sent away. It tasted to me of minerals and something faintly sweet, the way it always had. I still don't know what it tastes like to them, but the sound in the room, that three-toned sound in all its voices, layered into the chord I'd heard only once before, told me something about it that I don't need words for. She found me that afternoon in the kitchen. I was prepping for the evening meal, which I'd decided would be the most careful meal I'd made yet. I'd spent the previous night making notes, pulling everything I'd learned about each child's preferences, building a menu around those notes. It was going to take 4 hours and I'd started early. She came in without asking this time. We were past asking and sat on the stool and watched me work. We were quiet for a while. What happens now, I asked eventually, not pointedly, just genuinely. The formal repatriation process, she said. It will take time. The GHR has protocols. The Imperial Court has counter-protocols. There are records to reconcile, placements to arrange. Most of the children will go to family houses within the second house's territory. Some have specific relatives who have been located. A few will require different arrangements. How long, I said. Months, she said. The estimate is 2 to 3 standard months before the last placements are finalized. Some may be here for the full duration. I absorbed this. I'll keep cooking, I said. I know, she said. For the ones who are still here through the process, I said, however long it takes. I know, she said again. I kept working, she watched. I'm going to ask something, she said after a while. I'm going to ask it formally, through the proper channels, once I'm back on my vessel and the appropriate documentation can be prepared. But I want to say it here first in this room, before it becomes a formal thing. I looked at her. I would like to request your presence at the formal reunification ceremony, she said, when it occurs, wherever it occurs, as a named participant, not as support personnel or GHR representative. I didn't know what to say. That's a significant thing to be asked, I said finally. Yes, she said, it is. I'm just a cook, I said. You are the person who showed up every day, she said. To Faranathi children, especially to children who have survived what these children survived, there is no just about that. I looked at the pot on the heat. I'll be there, I said. Good, she said. We were quiet for another long time. Silt has a gift for this, she said eventually, the cooking. I know, I said. He feels the heat really well. He is going to someone who will teach him formally when he goes home, she said. There are culinary academies in the second house. He has been interested in food making since before the conflict. His caregivers noted it. Good, I said, and meant it the way you mean it when something is genuinely good and the word is just barely adequate. I am going to tell him, she said, that his first proper teacher was a human who burned himself twice on the heating unit calibration. Please don't, I said. I absolutely will, she said. She left the next morning. The children knew she was going. She had told them the night before, I think, explained the process, the timeline, what came next. I wasn't there for that. But when the departure announcement came through, they were assembled in the common area, not with the terrible stillness of before, but with something more bearable. Still hard, but manageable. She came to the kitchen before she went to the dock. I had a package ready. I'd stayed up to prepare it, everything I'd learned and noted, written up carefully. Every child's preferences, sensitivities, best meals, notes on what worked and what hadn't, the mineral supplement ratios, the temperature calibrations, the recipe I'd built for the warm beverage. Written in a format I hoped was useful. This is everything I know, I said, for whoever takes over the food program when I eventually go, or for wherever they end up. She took the package. She held it in her primary hands and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at me. I don't have a word for you, she said. In any language I know, there should be a word. There'll be a word, I said. Give it time. Languages figure out what they need. She made the triple-toned laugh again, not suppressed this time. I'm going to use that, she said. I'm going to tell several scholars that a human told me languages figure out what they need and see what happens. Let me know, I said. She held out her primary hands, both of them, palms up, which the database told me was a formal gesture of full acknowledgement, not often offered to non-Faranathi. I put my hands over hers for a moment, my hands with the flower on the sleeve and the burned scar on the heel of my right palm. Thank you, she said. Come back sometime, I said. I'll make the bread. She was gone by 9:20. By 9:45, I was back in the kitchen. By 1000, I had the grain on the heat and the bread in the unit. By 10:15, the children were at the kitchen hatch. Ember first, then Silt on the step stool, then Rain and Stone together, then the others arranging themselves in their particular way. The station's atmospheric processors hummed their constant low note. The bread began to smell the way bread does when it's getting close. Ember was watching me work. She had her arms folded, 3 of them anyway. The 4th was resting on the sill of the kitchen hatch, one hand loose, in a posture I recognized as her most relaxed one, the one she'd taken longer to arrive at than any of the others. "Good morning," I said. She made the two-toned sound, familiar, known, yes. I turned back to the counter. "And I kept cooking,"